Okay, we're ready to start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our fourth installment of the development of Torah. We've been focusing on the oral Torah because Judaism, if we want to be honest, every bit of what Jews who do anything that's Jewish is not from the Bible in its practice. It's based on the oral law. I'll give you an example. Every denomination of Judaism blows the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Not a kazoo, not a flute, not a trumpet, but a shofar. It does not say to blow a shofar in the Torah. It's based totally on the oral tradition. But just one example, a very glaring example of how even people who say they don't believe in the oral Torah, some say they don't believe in any part of the Torah, but some who try to divide between the oral Torah and the written Torah, they don't realize that much of what they do that is Jewish is taken from the oral Torah. So the oral Torah is really the backbone of Judaism, of Jewish practice. We would know nothing about Judaism if we just had the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, which I explained last week is merely the outline, the way a professor would write an outline of his lecture before the lecture, and had any student appropriated the outline thinking that they don't have to show up for class. I once got a Israeli student who came to me at the beginning of the semester when I taught Talmud at UB, and he said to me, "I'm from Israel, so I know it all." He didn't exactly say that, but it amounted to that. Can I just get a grade at the end of the year and not show up for any classes? So I told him, fine, that's fine with me. I'm going to give you a page of Talmud. I want you to study it and come back to me to see if you really were able to master it. And I never saw him again. So we depend on the oral law because the written Torah is an outline, and you can't learn everything just from an outline. You have to have the lecture, which is the oral law. The 5 books of Moses is like the outline. So the question that we left off last class 2 weeks ago is, why couldn't the oral law be put into writing? Why couldn't the oral law tell us, blow a shofar on Rosh Hashanah? And we wouldn't have to depend on an oral tradition to know that when the Torah says it's a day of blowing, that it means a shofar. Let the Torah say that clearly. Yes?
Rabbi, the tone of the oral Torah is completely opposite from the written Torah. The written Torah has a strictness and a certain inflexibility that the oral Torah is the exact opposite.
Okay, the comment was that the written Torah is very rigid and the oral Torah is flexible, and that's very true. The styles are very, very different. But why couldn't more information be put into writing? And the truth is, it eventually was put into writing, which is going to beg another question. If oral Torah is so important, why did Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in the 2nd century of the Common Era, why did he decide to put some of it into writing, and then subsequent generations put more of it into writing? So we're going to tackle those 2 questions. First question is, why wasn't the oral Torah put into writing? So the first answer given, these are not my answers, the first answer given is that there's no end to the oral Torah. It's continuing as we speak. Right now, scholars, rabbinic scholars, are grappling with issues based on their way of applying existing principles of Jewish law to developing situations. So there's the oral law is an ongoing, it's just like, to use the example of the Supreme Court. There's a Constitution in the United States, And the Supreme Court is constantly interpreting and reinterpreting and applying it to new situations. Now, this Constitution, of course, is man-made and therefore fallible, and therefore some things could be wrong, obviously. But the principle, the idea that you can have a continuing, why don't we just put all Supreme Court decisions in the Constitution? The Constitution would be thousands of volumes. It would be impossible to navigate. Well, in a similar way, if they would have put the oral Torah in writing, it would take, the Torah would be zillions of pages, much more than just the Constitution of the United States and the Supreme Court decisions. So that's the first reason. But that's not an adequate enough reason. And the reason why it's not adequate is because, okay, there are certain aspects of the oral law that are continuing, that are growing, but there are certain things that could have been explained very easily. For example, and we spoke about this example before, an eye for an eye. And the Torah makes it sound like you take out someone's eye, they take out your eye. And that has never been the case. The oral tradition said clearly it means pay compensation for that eye. The same way, maybe not identical, but in a similar way that a court today would give someone who's injured a payment, a monetary payment for the damage, for the pain, for the suffering, and so on and so forth. So that's what an eye for an eye is. But why didn't the Torah just say an eye for an eye? Means payment for the eye. That would have made things a lot easier. We wouldn't have been blamed. We wouldn't have been accused of being filled with vengeance. You know, an eye, take out an eye, we'll take out your eye. The Torah is not a Torah of vengeance, but that's what we've been accused of. Why couldn't the Torah say that you take a fruit on the holiday of Sukkot called an etrog? Why does it just say a beautiful fruit, or fruit of a beautiful tree? You can translate it both ways. It could have been very clear. So that it's obvious that the Torah deliberately wrote things in cryptic form so that people cannot follow the Torah without the oral tradition. Why was it so important for that oral tradition to be? So, one reason, a very down-to-earth reason, is that contrary to what most people think, a written text could be distorted, manipulated, and completely misinterpreted. To give you an example, the most important verse and phrase in the Torah and in Jewish life is what? What's the most important phrase? Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, God is our God, God is one. Those are the most powerful words. Why are they so powerful? Because they affirm our belief in one God. And how many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews died with those words on their lips because they refused to abandon their belief, to even give lip service to a religion that says there's more than one God. So that's the most important prayer, affirming our belief in one God. You know how the other religion translates that? That there are three gods. Hear, O Israel, God, okay, that's one, is our God. Two, God, the third one is one. There's a Trinity, and the Trinity is all one happy family. That's idolatry to us. Jews died rather than even saying that they believe in a Trinity. And yet, the same words that have been interpreted by us to mean absolutely one God, not a composite God, certainly not many gods, was taken by another religion and interpreted the very opposite. A written word in the hands of unscrupulous people or unsuspecting people, ignorant people, doesn't have to be with malice, it could be even unintentionally, will be distorted, guaranteed. You need a living human being to impart the message without the possibility of it being distorted. So we know, Jews have known, even the most ignorant Jew has known, that when we say God is one, we mean God is one. I don't know a Jew who'll tell you, you know what, does Judaism believe in many gods? Does Judaism believe in a Trinity? The most ignorant Jew knows that's not true. Why? Not because it's written in the Torah alone. It's because it has been transmitted by teachers to students, parents to children, that it means absolutely one God without any compromise of the idea of oneness. That's just a very good example. But there are many other examples where words can be distorted because they're in print. If you knew that the Torah, all of it, the written and the oral, was in a library, you'd say, I don't have to go to school. I don't have to have a teacher. I can be an autodidact. I can teach myself, going to the library, taking out the book, and learning how to be a Jew. But because the oral Torah was oral, you couldn't do that. You couldn't just go to a library. You read the Torah and say, 1 second, what does this mean? How do I interpret this? Then you're forced to go to the teachers, to the rabbis, to the sages, or it could be your parents, for that matter, and they will set you straight. So that's the most basic reason why the Torah was intended to be partly written, the outline, but mostly oral. But then there's another reason, goes to the next, another dimension of it. There's much more to Torah than just the laws. It's the spirit, the neshama, the soul of Torah, that you cannot transmit through a book. No matter how powerful the Torah is, if you didn't have humans with feelings, with passion, with dedication, with spirituality, being the ones to impart that message to the next generation, we would lose, we may have not lost the text of the Torah itself, the laws themselves, although that would also happen, but we'd lose, what's important is the spirit behind those laws. You can't transmit spiritual knowledge just through a book. You have to have connection to a human being. And in transmitting the Torah orally, that guarantees that there's a link that we have to our forebears, and they to their forebears, going all the way back to Mount Sinai. We have captured the spirit of Mount Sinai through the oral Torah. You know, when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, people heard 10 statements. But they also heard the thunder, and they saw the lightning. And it was much more than just God giving them a list of do's and don'ts. There was a spiritual experience. What happened to that spiritual experience? What happened to it is that humans who study Torah have to capture those spiritual feelings and impart them to the next generation. That's why if you have a teacher who is very secular oriented, even if that person is well versed in Torah, you're missing something. You're missing the spirit, the soul, the divine, the spiritual aspect of Judaism. At Mount Sinai, we got both commandments, and we also got spiritual feelings. Thunder and lightning. Thunder and lightning was a physical phenomenon, but it also represents a spiritual thunder, spiritual lightning. And that can only be preserved by human interaction, because we human beings are not just physical beings, we also have souls. And when you're in touch with your soul, you can impart spiritual feelings together with the actual laws that could be very dry on their own. So that's basically, those are the reasons why the Torah was meant to be oral, to preserve that connection, that link to Sinai.
Rabbi, it says in our book that you shall not add, you shall not subtract. When you read Kabbalah, after you read the written Torah, it's like you're reading something like, this is completely different. This is stretched so far from what it says, from what the written Torah says. On the other hand, it says, you're created in my image. So in a way, it gives you permission to do that.
Well, we don't need permission to do that, because that was the Kabbalah, the mystical teaching. The question was, the Kabbalah, the mystical teachings are so far away from the literal text of the Torah. And the answer is, the mystical teachings are part of the oral tradition. The oral tradition is not just explaining what the meaning of the laws are, that eye for an eye doesn't mean literally an eye for eye, it means compensation, but it also transmitted the mysteries of Torah, the Kabbalistic, esoteric aspects of Torah. They were also preserved at Mount Sinai. It was transmitted at Mount Sinai and preserved through the generations of teachers. Not everyone was privy to these teachings of Kabbalah, but those who were transmitted it to the next generation. Now, here a question is asked. I've often heard people ask this question. Okay, so we have Torah and information, knowledge, transmitted from one generation to another by human beings. Isn't that a recipe for distortion? And they often refer to the game called telephone. What happens when people play telephone? You whisper something to one person, and they whisper to another, and by the time it comes to the end, there's no resemblance to the original message. So if this is how we have Judaism, it was Moses transmitted to the people of that generation, and they to the next generation, and it kept on going from one generation to another. By the time it comes to us, isn't it inevitable that it will be distorted? That's the challenge. And the answer to that challenge is there are at least five differences between the game of telephone and the oral Torah. Number one, telephone is a game. No one determines life and death situation based on that game of telephone. In other words, someone tells you, whispers something about how you could save your life when your life is in danger, and by the time it gets to the end, the method to save your life has been distorted. You can be sure that if it was life and death, the message would remain the same. People would not feel the liberty to distort it, even unintentionally. Torah was not a game. Torah was dead serious. Literally, life and death were in the hands of people who had to interpret the Torah. So they're not going to be whispering in a jovial way, in a game, in a frivolous way. It's dead serious. Number two, when we play the game of telephone, you don't shout the message. You whisper it. By design, that's how the game works. They're trying to show you that when you whisper something, the message will be distorted. When Torah is transmitted from one generation to another, it involves literal and figurative shouting. We don't just whisper the message, we teach it openly, without any hesitation. We don't compromise the way it's being transmitted. It's forceful, loud, and clear. And therefore, even if you were playing telephone that way, the message would not be distorted. Number three, when you play telephone, it's one person whispering to another, who whispers to another individual, as many individuals as you have. It's all individuals. Judaism was never based on one individual teaching to one individual. Moses did not just teach to his brother Aaron. Moses taught his brother Aaron, he taught his nephews, Aaron's children, he taught the elders, and then he taught everybody. And after he taught everybody, Aaron would then teach everybody, and then Aaron's sons would teach everybody. Multiple teachers, multiple layers of teachers. Not just one person teaching to one, but multitudes of people. And as time progressed, you had thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jewish adults teaching the children, the next generation. Very, very different from playing the game of telephone. Number four, in telephone, there's no provision for testing to find out if your message at the end is consistent with what was said at the beginning, because that would take the whole fun of the game would be lost, because there's no point in you don't have to preserve anything. But here, if someone distorts something, that happened many times. people would distort things. And then everyone else would say, 1 second, what are you doing? It's wrong. You can't distort things when the knowledge is everyone. You see, in some religions, the lay people are not supposed to have the knowledge. I believe in Catholicism, I don't know if it's still true, but only priests were allowed to study the Bible. It may have changed. What? It changed, right. But for many generations, they weren't supposed to study. And I'm sure there are still places where you have to depend only on the elite for information. Judaism has no such thing. That's why I don't like when people say a rabbi is a teacher. It's a common refrain. The reason I don't like that is because every Jew is obligated to be a teacher. The rabbi might just have more time on his hand because he doesn't have a job. So he has more time to teach. But he's not really exclusively a teacher. Every Jew, if you know Aleph, you have to teach it to someone who doesn't know it. No Jew has a right to say, I don't have to teach. And if you have to teach, you have to learn. No Jew is allowed to be ignorant by design. I'm sure there are times when people didn't have the opportunities, especially in times of persecution. Jews grew up not learning how to even read, or if there were minimal skills in Judaism. But we're talking about, while in other cultures, not everyone is not, even in America, are we all expected to be nuclear physicists? Are we all expected to be engineers? Are we all expected to be philosophers? No, if you want to specialize in that area, you go into that area. But Jews are all obligated to master all of Judaism. Obviously, some of us have limitations. It could be intellectual limitations. It could be we have to earn a living, we don't have the time, so the Torah excuses us. But the obligation of a Jew is to study Torah, to know Judaism, not just a rabbi. Rabbis, by default, because they are hired to do that job, so they do more teaching than others. But it's not that is what a rabbi is. A rabbi is really a judge. That's something that not everyone could be. Originally, rabbis were judges. And to be a judge, you had to be learned, and you also had to teach the next generation of judges. But anyhow, so when you're dealing with telephone, there's no way of testing to see if your interpretation is correct. But in Judaism, anyone who tries to distort something is immediately rejected. I think I gave this example once before, that I was once giving a talk in Rochester, and I made the point that Judaism has never changed. The same tefillin that we wear today was worn by Jews 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and they're identical. The tefillin are all made up of leather boxes, square boxes, with scrolls in them. And there was a rabbi there, a conservative rabbi, who was also an archaeologist. I forgot his name. And he said to me, "You're wrong. I have a pair of tefillin, an ancient pair of tefillin that are round." So my response to him was, the exception proves the rule. But I didn't realize, and later on I found it in the Talmud, the Mishnah, that there was a time when people made round tefillin, because the rationale for that is the Romans banned tefillin and threatened to murder any Jew who would wear tefillin. So some Jews thought, you know what we're going to do? We're going to change the shape of the tefillin so the Romans won't think that we're wearing tefillin. So they made it round. And the Mishnah immediately says, that's wrong. You can't do it. But apparently some people did do it. So we always have ways of testing. Someone comes up with a new thing. Someone today will say, let's make tefillin different colors. Why does it have to be black? Why not blue? The Israeli flag is blue. Let's make blue tefillin. Blue and white tefillin. Someone's going to do that. I'm sure someone will come up with that one day, and then everyone will say that's wrong, because everyone knows, because everyone has received the tradition. You can't fool around. You can't play games. Now, can't people make mistakes, even with all these guarantees and everything? Can't we distort things? I mean, we're human. We're fallible. Every human being is fallible. Well, let's think for a second. To whom did God give the Torah? To people. Does God not know our weaknesses, our limits? If he gave it to people, then he knew that inevitably there's going to be times when people, even well-intentioned people, even great scholars, towering scholars, will misinterpret something. You know, there's a whole volume of the Talmud devoted to the courts making mistakes, serious mistakes. So what does that mean? That means that God gave the Torah to humans, saying, you do the best you can do, and even when you make mistakes, I knew you were going to make those mistakes because I'm God. And I know everything, and I know the future, and I know what's in your mind. But I'm willing to have you make mistakes, and people should follow those mistakes until it's proven wrong. And it has happened many times. And then when you finally discover you made a mistake, you have to atone for it. And in certain cases, you have to bring special sacrifices in the days of the temple. If you look in the writings of Maimonides, for example, you can't find a greater titan of scholarship than the Maimonides. He was constantly crossing out his writings and changing his opinion. Not a small percentage of his writings, he wrote so much, but the greatest scholars are constantly going deeper and deeper into it, and they'll tell you, I made a mistake. The Talmud has many great rabbis. It's like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court getting up there in public and saying, you know what, my ruling yesterday was wrong. I made a mistake. But the rabbis were not afraid to do that. Why? Because that's part of the process. So because God knew that we're going to make those mistakes, if they're honest mistakes based on our misunderstanding of something, that was part of God's plan. In the same way, if we have two different opinions, two great people come up with opposite views, the Talmud says they can both be divinely inspired words. Why? Because God gave us humans who think differently, the same teachings, but it'll come out different. I gave the analogy the other day of putting water in a red glass or in a green glass, in a blue glass. The water is the same, but it has a different color to the people who are looking outside. When you put certain teachings in the minds of Shammai, it came out one way. Hillel came out a different way. They're both right. Although we can only follow one, and the Torah tells us what to do when there's a dispute. Now, sometimes a rabbi can be so off base that no one will say that that was divine. That would be something that would be corrected, and it would not be allowed to persist. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit of the oral law was the method to preserve the integrity of Judaism, and it's constantly growing because every time we have a new situation, and with modern technology, things are changing day by day. We have to then go into the existing Torah principles and apply it to the new situations. Could we change the Torah? Is there a process of amendments? Just like in the Constitution, we have an amendment process. And that's where we have our amendments to the Constitution, which were not written in the original. You could change it. Now there are certain conditions needed in order to put a new amendment, which is very hard to accomplish. But there is an amendment process. Is there an amendment process to the Torah? And the answer is no. Anything that's in biblical law, written or oral, if someone comes up and says, look, why are tefillin black and square? It would be nicer to make them round and other colors. And we get all the rabbis of the world to agree to do that. It would have no effect. Those rabbis would be considered criminals if they tried to do that, because you can't change any part of the Torah. Sometimes situations change, so the Torah has different advice, different directives that relates to that new situation that is different from the one before. But the law itself cannot be rescinded. Now, rabbinical laws, some of them can be changed. And that's another subject which would take us too much time to go into when they can be changed. But biblical laws can never be changed. Why? Because if they are God-given, people will say, but that was when the Torah was given, that was in how many years ago? 3,300 years ago. That was ancient times. We're in the 21st century. Shouldn't the Torah be updated? And the answer to that is, who gave us the Torah? God gave us the Torah. Do you think God doesn't know that there's going to be a 21st century and a 22nd century and a 28th century? God knows the future. And if he gave us a Torah, he knew that this Torah applies to every generation and every generation equally. There's no difference between one generation and another. The difference may be in our perception. The difference may be in our mentality. We may feel uncomfortable with certain things that people felt comfortable with in the past. But that's not our choice. You know, they tell the story of a coach driver. He had a wagon driver. He would transport people from different places in Europe. And one day he was hired in August, September, he was hired by a very wealthy merchant who had to transport merchandise from one city to a distant city. And he arranged with him that when he gets there on time, because the rich man had to be there at a fair to sell his wares, where his whole entire income came from, he says, if you get there by February 1st, I'm going to pay you very handsomely. And they agreed on everything, and the coach driver tried as hard as he could to get there in time, but there were snowstorms and weather conditions beyond his control. And he came a day late after the fair was over. And the rich man lost all his merchandise. It was all worthless. He had a major, major loss. And of course, he wasn't inclined to pay the coach driver for the transportation. And the coach driver says, it's not my fault. I had good intentions. I left early. I went as fast as I can get the horses to go, and I can't control the weather. Although I think it was a congresswoman who said that Jews control the weather. But this coach driver didn't subscribe to that. I can't change the weather, so why should I not get my pay? So they argued back and forth, and they came to the local rabbi. And the local rabbi heard both sides, and he retired to his study, did some research, and he came back and he said, based on Jewish law, it's very sad, but he doesn't have to pay you. Because there was a contract that you had to come there at that time, and there were no provisions for snowstorms that would be an exception. If you can't get there in time, then there's no need to pay. So the coach driver was indignant, and he says, tell me, what did you base that on? So I based it on the Torah. When was the Torah given? In Sivan, which is about June. Oh, in June. Of course, in June, it's very easy to travel. If the Torah had been given in January, the Torah would have come up with a totally different answer to this question. That's a joke they tell to illustrate the fallacy of the argument that because conditions have changed, we can change the laws. But it's based on something very, very simple. What's the main difference between secular law and Torah law? The main difference is, besides the fact that Torah law is divine and secular law is man-made, and everyone agrees with that, of course, but the main difference is that Jewish law, well, let's start with secular law. Secular law is made to deal with life situations, to deal with the needs of a society. You know, there have been laws that were written in the 18th century, 19th century about horses and buggies and all sorts of things that don't exist anymore. Those laws are anachronistic. We don't need them anymore because we don't travel by horse and buggy. So when laws are no longer relevant, they're discarded. Although some laws stay on the books forever because no one ever bothered to expunge them. But not most, but all of secular law is designed to take care of the needs of society. We have highways where cars drive. You have to have speed limits for the safety of the people. If there was no safety issue, then there would be no need for a speed limit. You have a red light because you have traffic going in different directions. You have to protect society. If there was no need to protect society, you wouldn't have a need for laws. And laws, therefore, not only can change, they should change, because society has changed, and there are different needs of society, different requirements. Jewish law is the opposite. Torah law was designed to mold and shape society. So while secular law is shaped by society, Torah law shapes society. See the difference? The Torah was here to take the society in which we are living and elevate that society, prevent the society from degenerating and enhancing whatever positive there is in society. So when situations change, that shouldn't change Torah. Torah was there to, in whichever situation you're in, the Torah has a directive for you. So if someone says, the argument you often hear people say, why should I keep kosher? The reason why the Torah prohibits pork is because there's an illness called trichinosis. And therefore they legislatively made a law that you shouldn't eat pork because you'll get sick if you eat pork. That's the argument I heard from the time I was a child until recent times. But that's not the reason why we can't eat pork. The reason is, and for that matter, anything that's not kosher, the reason is because God says, I want you to be a holy people. I want your food that you eat to conform to my will. That way you elevate the food, and certain foods cannot be elevated, whatever the rationale is, but it's God's commandment to us that has nothing to do with health reasons. And people who believe it's health reasons, how did they know about trichinosis 3,000 years ago? It makes Moses into a biologist, into a doctor, and no one has to believe that Moses was an MD. You're not a heretic if you don't think that he was an MD. He didn't know those things. So it's not for health reasons. It has nothing to do with health reasons. Some people say circumcision. That's for health reasons. It prevents certain types of illnesses. That's not the reason we do circumcision. It's a covenant between us and God. And the same thing is true with all the different ways of rationalizing different commandments. They're not for those reasons. Now, it is true that some Jewish practices do provide better health conditions. Jews were always washing their hands and always immersing themselves in a mikveh. And that's why people speculate Jews suffered less. I don't even know if it's true, but that's what people say during the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, which Jews are accused of spreading, poisoning the wells. And the reason why they accuse Jews, although you don't need a reason to accuse Jews of anything, but the reason that purportedly was that Jews were suffering less. So it must be that Jews are poisoning the wells and they don't poison their own wells. But the argument is that the reason why Jews suffered less is because of hygienic practices that Jews engaged in. But the reasons we engage in hygienic practices has nothing to do with hygiene. For example, when we wash our hands before eating bread, the hands have to be clean before we wash them. When a woman goes to the mikveh or a man goes to a mikveh, he has to shower before thoroughly to make sure there's absolutely nothing, not even a speck of anything that's not part of the body itself. Otherwise, the mikveh is ineffective. You have to be clean before you wash yourself or immerse in the mikveh. Why? Because the immersion in the mikveh or the washing of the hands has nothing to do with health. It has to do with spiritual health. And it just happens to be that there's a byproduct, there's a benefit, a side benefit, that it makes you less likely to contract certain diseases because you're clean. But that's not the reason why we keep these laws. In fact, the belief that the Torah is divine and cannot be changed are two of the 13 principles of faith. What does a Jew believe in? What does the Jew have to believe in? The Torah doesn't tell you what to believe in. The Torah just tells you statements of fact, of things that happened, and commandments. But beliefs are not mentioned explicitly in the Torah, but they are preserved in the oral tradition based on many statements in the Torah. Maimonides was the first person that we know of to formulate principles of faith, things that a Jew has to believe in. The first thing, of course, is God. Without God, there's no Judaism. You have to believe that there's one God, that God doesn't have a body. But 2 of the 13 principles include the one that you have to believe that God gave the Torah to Moses, and through him to the entire Jewish people, and that another principle is that the Torah can never be changed. It can't be substituted, it can't be exchanged, it can't be altered, it can't be edited. The Torah, the way it was given to us, is still relevant today.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So if that's so, and we don't modify our laws for society, we in a sense were forced to get rid of laws of sacrifice because of the needs and demands of society.
No. The reason why we don't have sacrifices today is because the Torah says you're not allowed to offer sacrifices outside of the temple. And we don't have the Beit HaMikdash. We don't have it, so we can't offer sacrifices. Actually, there is an opinion in the Talmud that even after the destruction of the temple, we could still bring sacrifices, but only certain sacrifices, and we have other conditions that we can't fulfill today.
Wasn't it Maimonides' opinion that these were meant to only be symbolic anyway?
No. Maimonides explains different commandments philosophically. This is another aspect of Torah. The Torah tells us to do something. It tells us to not eat milk and meat that are cooked together. What is the reason for it? So there's some tension between different philosophers. Some say we shouldn't be looking for reasons because the Torah doesn't give a reason. It's God's commandment, and we do it because God said so. We're not allowed to wear a garment that has wool and linen in it. What's the reason? No need for a reason. It's a divine commandment. If God tells us to do something, he knows what he's doing. He knows what he wants of us, and we have to just submit to his will. Some authorities, including Maimonides, says, no, you could look for reasons. We may not find reasons for everything, but to the extent that we can give reasons, there's nothing wrong with giving reasons for different commandments. And in fact, he gives a reason for not eating milk and meat. He says that was a pagan ritual. They would cook a kid in the milk of its mother in offering to their pagan gods, and therefore the Torah wants to distance us as much as possible from idolatry. Likewise, the priests used to wear wool and linen in their garments, that we should distance ourselves from that by not wearing that kind of a garment, not eating that type of food. So he gives reasons for many, many other commandments, and some he says, I'm stumped, I can't think of any reason. So other philosophers didn't like his approach of looking for reasons. But the truth is, there's nothing wrong with looking for reasons as long as you know that the reason doesn't dictate the law. The law is beyond the reason, but there's nothing wrong with looking for reasons that make the law more palatable, more relevant to us, more exciting. Now, what happened at Mount Sinai was the giving of the Torah in its entirety. The Talmud makes a statement, a very radical statement, that every bit of Jewish knowledge, including a novel idea, interpretation, that a worthy student will introduce. Today, a worthy student thinks of a new way of interpreting a biblical verse. That was given at Mount Sinai. Yes.
That's the key word. And which makes the fallacy, what I think is a fallacy to what you've been saying about the oral teachings and everybody's a teacher. You call that a worthy student. You have to define worthy.
Okay, I knew that would. What do I mean by worthy student? Okay,
because if somebody is not worthy, and all Jews are teachers, and they're not all worthy students.
Okay. I have to qualify when I said that all Jews are teachers. Not all Jews are good teachers.
So therefore,
And not all students are worthy students. That's true. There are people who use Torah for their own advancement, for their own selfish.
Some people do it with good intent.
And some do it with good intent, but the road to you know what place is paved with good intentions. So there is a negative side to transmitting things orally, or being a teacher, that you have sometimes very bad teachers, for whatever reason, intentionally or not intentionally. So I'll give you the criteria, the basic criteria. How do you know if someone is a worthy teacher or a worthy student? The first criteria is that they believe in what they're teaching. If a justice to the Supreme Court, to give you an example, says, you know what, I'm brilliant. I know the laws, American law, better than anyone else in the country. Top law professor. But I don't believe in the Constitution. I don't believe the Constitution is a good document. I would like to overthrow the government. I'm a communist, but I need a job, and I'm qualified to be a judge based on my knowledge. Would you want that person in the Supreme Court? No, although that might happen. We never know. Things are going crazier and crazier.
They're closer to reality, and not as far-fetched as what you're saying, that make it difficult. I mean, they may believe, but they don't really understand what they believe.
Okay. No, that's the first criteria. You have to first believe in the system in order for you to be a teacher of the system. The second criteria is that you have to be knowledgeable, obviously, of the law. You can't just say, it's a free-for-all, I can do whatever I want, say whatever I want. You have to be knowledgeable. Number three, you also have to be loyal to the law. Not just believe in it, but practice it. No one is perfect, but if you know a Supreme Court justice says openly, I do not follow American law, constitutional law. I reject it, or I have rejected it, and I'm not sorry for it. That would disqualify him. If a rabbi says, I don't have to practice Jewish law, I don't have to do this, then that disqualifies him automatically. Now, the Talmud tells a story of a renegade rabbi, who became a heretic. He was a brilliant scholar, and he rebelled against Judaism. He rebelled against the Jewish people. He aligned himself with the Romans. He became a very evil man. And his best student, Rabbi Meir, continued studying under him. So the other rabbi said, how could you continue studying under him? And he said, it's like eating a fruit. You spit out the pit, but you eat the rest of the fruit. I know how to spit out the pit. But it was not recommended for anyone else. Don't go to that type of a teacher, even though he's brilliant and he knows what he's teaching. That's not the person you should choose as a teacher. Unless you're like Rabbi Meir, who can spit out the pit, and you know where the pit is. Another version of it, it's like eating a pomegranate. You eat the seeds, but you throw out the peel. Either way, it's the same idea. So you have to have, a worthy student is also someone who's sincere about Judaism and is not learning for the sake of, there are Christian missionaries who study Torah, and they even try to study Talmud to ensnare Jewish people, saying we know the Talmud, and they're very often more educated than a lot of Jews, and they could convince them that the Talmud even agrees with us. That's not a worthy student. So, but what is it if a worthy student comes up with a new idea? We're sitting in a class, we're studying Torah, and one of you says, I think there's a way of explaining this verse in a new way. No one else said it before, and it makes sense. It doesn't contradict any accepted Jewish values and beliefs. That was given at Mount Sinai also. You revealed something that was implicit in the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai, but not explicit. But it was there, and I like to use an analogy. You have this great artist who draws this incredible piece of art, the Mona Lisa. What does the Mona Lisa mean to you? It can mean so many different things, and I'm sure there are books written about it, about what the art or any other great piece of art, what kind of feelings it's supposed to evoke, what was the artist's intention, and what is there in that, or in Shakespeare's works. How many thousands of books have been written about Shakespeare's plays? Does anyone know how many thousands of books? I don't know, but thousands of books have been written. And everyone comes up with new ideas that Shakespeare says something. I'm sure Shakespeare didn't have all those things in mind. But who cares? His works can mean so many different things, and you constantly find new meaning in his works. But that's because Shakespeare was a human being. When God put it in the Torah, he knew what people are going to say, how they're going to interpret it. So when he gave us the so-called 10 statements, 10 commandments, in those 10 commandments, implicit is all of Jewish knowledge that will ever be revealed to the end of time. And it takes a great student, a worthy student, to discover new meanings that are constantly being revealed. And they were all given at Mount Sinai. If they fit the test of being given by a worthy student and they're not illogical and, sometimes off totally out of left field, those are also part of Torah. Okay, any questions? Yes?
When Yom Tovim outside the land of Israel, they tapped on the extra day.
That's a rabbinical. That's a rabbinical law. So we weren't talking about rabbinical laws. When we say oral Torah, we're talking about things that were transmitted at Mount Sinai that clarify the meaning of things that are written in the 5 books of Moses. But then there is also, the Torah gave the rabbis the license to legislate new laws, and we discussed that in one of the earlier classes, that some of the laws are there to protect biblical laws, some of the laws are there to protect society. They have all a few different categories, and some of those laws, rabbinic laws, can be changed. They're not as solid as biblical law, because the rabbis themselves gave room for their laws. I'll give you an example. The rabbis once banned using oil from non-Jews. And the reason they made that ban is because people using oil that would cause people to fraternize with pagans, with idol worshippers, and that would lead to assimilation, to intermarriage and assimilation. And then it was rescinded. Why was it rescinded? Because the law was not embraced by the Jewish people. No one was following it. It was like too radical, and the rabbi saw that no one was following it, so they rescinded it. But normally, even rabbinic laws, you can't just rescind arbitrarily. There is very limited situations, but biblical laws, definitely not. There is one exception, even in biblical law, that a law could be overridden on a one-time basis. If a prophet, a real prophet, that we know is a prophet, tells us to violate a law, a one-time basis for some emergency situation, we're obligated to listen to that prophet. But if he tells you this law is no longer relevant, period, that is, he's a false prophet.
It says that in the Torah, the one-time basis? Or
Yeah, that's in the Torah, yeah.
In the written or oral?
In the written Torah. It's in the written Torah. It says in the Torah about listening to prophets, and it uses a very strong term. To him you shall listen. It's not clear that it means you should listen even when he goes against the Torah, but there's a biblical story of Elijah, the prophet, who had to prove that the worshippers of the Baal, the idol called Baal, was a false god. So he made a test with bringing an offering outside of the temple, far away from the temple. That was not allowed under normal circumstances, but Elijah was a prophet, and it was a one-time thing, and he was allowed to do it. So that's the only exception, when a prophet on a one-time, an ad hoc basis tells you to violate any of the laws except for idolatry. That never, not even one time. Okay? Any questions from the Zoomies? No questions yet?